Official multiculturalism was viewed as groundbreaking public policy in 1971 when the Government of Canada declared it. Today, as the world becomes ever more connected, multiculturalism has become a fact for societies around the world. For many, it is seen as a gift, but for an increasing number, it's seen as a threat. Joining us now to discuss the future of multiculturalism in the world, Denise Dresser. She is named by Forbes magazine as one of the most powerful women in Mexico. She is professor of political science at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM for short. Pico Iyer is here, world traveler, author most recently of The Art of Stillness, Adventures in Going Nowhere. Abdul Rahman Malik, journalist and programs manager for The Radical Middle Way in London, UK. And Josef Haslinger, novelist and professor of literature at the University of Leipzig and president of PEN Germany. And it's great to have all of you around this table here today. May I say welcome back to you. You're the only one who's been here before. We had you on
ages ago.
10, 15 years ago or something like that. So delighted that we didn't ruin the occasion last time and you've decided to come back. That's great. Let's get into this. Here's the quote I want to put on the table to start things here. We thought we were heading towards more inclusive societies. Instead, we are at risk of regressing to cruder and more exclusionary notions of belonging. This is the sentence that essentially frames the three-day conference that has brought you all here to Toronto, Ontario, Canada, for the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, the conference that they're putting on that you've all been invited to. And to that end, Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this map where we can show diversity in the world. The map shows that the most ethnically diverse countries in the world are actually found in Africa. It also shows that even though immigration is so much part of its lore, the United States falls near the middle of the scale. Canada and Mexico, more diverse than the U.S., but Canada the only Western country to break into the top 20 diverse countries in the world. And a look at Europe shows how ethnically homogeneous it still is. All right, let's go around the table. Josef, I want to start with you. Last Sunday, the anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany party won 14% of the votes in the local elections that were held in Berlin. What does that tell you about the attitude towards diversity in Germany today?
Berlin is different. If you would vote on the countryside, the figures would be much higher. So 14% in Berlin doesn't really frighten me. I can live with 10 up to 15% right-wing people, racist. We can live with that. This is not really a frightening number.
What would be frightening?
Frightening 30%. For example, if you look in Austria, the FPÖ, the so-called liberal party, but they're actually a very right-wing and racist party, they have around 35% at the moment. And that is frightening. So they really can put pressure on the issues. With 14%, you can't.
Are they in a position, do you think, at some point in the near future to have a much more meaningful, who knows, even governing role in either Germany or Austria?
In Austria, it may happen, yes. Austria, in this case, Austria would join the attitudes which you find in Hungary, in Poland, in Czech Republic, and in Slovakia. These are four countries, the so-called Visegrad states, Visegrad nations, four countries which don't take refugees at all. So they have decided not to take refugees, not to be part of this European endeavor to take refugees as a common obligation.
The host hates it when he makes a mistake right off the top of the program, but I did, and I got to fess up. You've been here before, too.
I have.
You were here almost 15 years ago.
2002, 2003.
Right, okay. And again, same thing I would say to you that I said to Pico. I guess the experience wasn't so horrible that you have decided not to come back.
It's wonderful to be back.
Okay, you're born here, we should say. You now reside in the United Kingdom. Let me get your, we've done a lot of this lately, but I want to get your take on it. Brexit. A response to fears that more immigration and more diversity means we're less British? Is that how you see it?
I think that's certainly a part of it, Steve, but I think there's a lot going on around the Brexit debate. I think one of it is a sense by of people of powerlessness, the fact that the political process doesn't represent them. They don't feel represented by the mainstream parties. In some way, this vote, the Brexit vote, was an opportunity for grassroots political expression, for people to say, well, for the first time, I have direct control over the direction in which my country is going. The first past the post parliamentary system doesn't allow for that. Local council elections don't allow for that. But this time, my vote really counts. And so we found in places of the United Kingdom like Sunderland, which rely on European Union investment and a lot of foreign investment, voting to leave. And that, I think, surprised the political establishment. But I don't think it surprised many of us who believed that for a long time there's been a power deficit felt by grassroots and also by white working class people. We've been seeing the emergence in places like the United Kingdom of a marginalization of the white working class as much as there's a marginalization of other minority communities who've been economically marginalized. This time we saw that particular group of people develop a kind of solidarity around Brexit. Are there concerns about immigration? Absolutely there are. But in some cases, they've come from interesting places. I'll tell you, I've had conversations in the community that I live in Tower Hamlets, in East London, where 48% of the population in my borough of London is Muslim. I live in an area which is over 60% of Bangladeshi origin. And when I speak to some of the uncles and aunties who live in the council flats around me, many of them said that they voted to leave. And I was like, why did you vote to leave? He goes, I'm very worried about those Romanians and those Hungarians coming and taking our jobs because these are third, fourth, fifth generation British people.
Let me ask you about one of those groups you didn't mention on that list, and that's the Poles. There is a fascinating and disturbing phenomenon happening right now as it relates to Polish citizens. A Polish immigrant killed in Essex at the end of August. 31 attacks on Polish immigrants since the Brexit vote. There are 1 million Poles, apparently, who started emigrating to the United Kingdom since Poland joined the EU 12 years ago. Why so much animosity towards Poles?
You know, it's interesting because the Polish migration has always been kind of a trope for the political right. It's always sort of, the Poles have always represented the Europe's increasing incursions on, in inverted commas, British borders. And I think that's been there for a long time. This particular outbreak of violence mirrors similar outbreaks of violence against other ethnic and religious minority communities in the United Kingdom. When the Essex murder happened, what we saw was something very interesting. You saw communities that otherwise would not have come together. You saw, Muslim communities and Jewish communities and Polish communities and African communities marching together in memory and to mark the fact that this kind of violence was unacceptable.
One more follow-up question. There are apparently 10,000 migrants in Calais, many of them from Africa, who are waiting to be let into Britain. Any chance of that happening right now?
I think the political situation certainly mitigates against it. And the question about refugees and the question about the role that Britain will play in being a country of safe haven to an increasing number of people who are not just fleeing economic violence, but actual political violence and the desettling violence that we've seen in Syria and places like Chad and South Sudan. I think it's a real political question right now. Now we have a new government which hasn't really been very clear on how they're going to deal with the situation. I think that's a matter of concern. Okay,
Denise Dresser, you live in Mexico, which is one of the more ethnically diverse countries in the world, but not necessarily culturally diverse. 93% of the people there speak Spanish, 83% are Roman Catholic. As you look from your vantage point at Europe today, what do you think the greatest source of fear and animosity towards immigrants is?
I don't think that Mexico is looking at Europe. It is looking at the United States because of Donald Trump. And I'd like to put that issue squarely on the table because we are facing as Mexicans probably one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the 21st century. An American presidential candidate who is threatening to deport over 10 million illegal immigrants living in the United States, who is threatening to build a wall. If you want to talk about obstacles to diversity, here is a man who could be leading the most powerful country in the world, who is threatening to construct a barrier to end diversity, to end immigration, to end what has become one of the greatest strengths of American history, which is its inclusiveness, its melting pot status, the fact that Latinos now comprise 40% of the population in many states and are a huge potential voting bloc and a huge source of economic stability and innovation and creativity in the US. And Donald Trump wants to end that. And it's not only regarding Mexicans, it's regarding Syrians, it's regarding Muslims in general. I think if we want to address the issue of diversity as a topic of concern, we have to focus on what's happening in the American election and how that's going to affect the rest of the world.
Why so much animus towards Mexicans in particular? He's not talking about building a wall to Canada, he's talking about building a wall with Mexico.
This goes back to, I think, an argument that Samuel Huntington made in a book that I think runs counter to the intelligence he demonstrated in a lot of his other work. He wrote a book called Who Are We?, where he essentially argued that Mexicans were eroding the American narrative, the American spirit, American culture, that they weren't Protestant enough, they were Catholic, they were lazy, they weren't hardworking. And I think Trump has built on that narrative. It's a narrative that stems from fears of globalization, that stems from growing economic inequality, that signals the other, the alien, as responsible for many of the economic and social woes that the U.S. is facing, that don't specifically target just Mexicans. They even are targeting their African American population. Look at the problem that the U.S. is facing vis-a-vis policing and blacks. I think the U.S. Is facing a critical juncture in its history in terms of how it deals with diversity. And you're seeing a strain that runs deep in American culture and civil society that is not accepting, is not inclusive, I think is blatantly racist. And this, as we've seen in other places in the world, helps build political coalitions. We saw it in Bosnia. We saw it in Rwanda. Creating ethnic hatred builds political capital for certain leaders. And I think as Trump is building this republic of the other as a way of strengthening, bolstering his presidential bid.
I want to be clear that I know what you're saying, because you've taken two examples that resulted in genocide. Are you saying that the logical extension of Trumpism is potential genocide in the United States?
I wouldn't say that. I do think that a lot of this is political rhetoric, that a lot of it you just won't be able to carry it out in terms of public policy, because there actually is a division of powers and weights and counterweights and checks and balances in the U.S. But I do think the U.S. is headed towards a devastating moment in its history. Even if Hillary Clinton wins the election, she's still going to have to deal with that part of American society that the Republican Party has angered and has resorted to the worst demons of American nature instead of the best angels, the better angels of the American character.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Pico, your turn. Let's start with this. How long have you lived in Japan for?
29 years.
29 years?
Yes. Your
significant other?
Japanese.
Speaks any English?
Not that much, but more than I speak Japanese, actually.
One of these days you're going to come back here and tell us how you two communicate. But the country that you've been in for 29 years famously rejects immigration.
Yes.
Is monoculturalism defensible in your eyes?
From their point of view, yes, but they're clearly out of tune with the moment, and they're clearly falling behind in their treatment of women, in their treatment of LGBT communities, and especially in their treatment of the other and people who look like me. So you're absolutely right. Every time I flew back to this country that I love and respect and have a lot to learn from, they would strip search me. And I look like exactly what they don't want to incorporate into their society. But I think that's why Japan is losing out vis-a-vis China and Korea and some of its neighbors. So Japan is one of those societies that functions almost like a symphony. Everybody is working from the same sheet of music. Each person is selflessly playing her part, and thus they make a very harmonious society, and thus every foreigner is a huge potential disruption. So I can see that precisely the monoculturalism that they embrace allows Japan to be seamless and efficient and to work on its own terms flawlessly. But as you know, countries can't work on their own terms in the global era. And so I think Japan is going to have to adjust very quickly.
It is aging. It is culturally and ethnically, do I say homogeneous or homogenous? Which do you prefer?
Homogeneous is what I say,
Okay,
yes.
all right. Is it committing collective suicide by not sort of understanding that here's the way the world's going and you're going in the opposite direction?
It is. And of course, the distance is increasing between it and the rest of the world, and it's rather impervious to what is going on in the world, or even ignorant of it. So as you say, the birth rate is declining, and there's reluctant to bring in people from elsewhere. I take a small amount of solace from the fact that I think just 2 weeks ago, the new Miss Japan is actually half Indian by ancestry. Miss Japan of last year was half African American, and last month I was in Japan watching the Olympics, and as you may remember, the Japanese team got a silver medal in the relay race, of all things, partly because one of their main runners was half Jamaican. And I'd say 50% of the Japanese athletes who were featured were half Jamaican, half Ghanaian, half American, whatever. And so in certain domains, they're seeing the fruits of letting in the rest of the world, but in others, they're reflexively pushing it away.
You did speak about this, actually, at a TED conference talk that you gave 3 years ago in Edinburgh, and I think for all of our edification, we should just play a little clip of that. So Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it.
The number of people living in countries not their own now comes to 220 million. And that's an almost unimaginable number, but it means that if you took the whole population of Canada and the whole population of Australia, and then the whole population of Australia again, and the whole population of Canada again, and doubled that number, you would still have fewer people than belong to this great floating tribe. And the number of us who live outside the old nation-state categories is increasing so quickly, by 64 million just in the last 12 years, that soon there will be more of us than there are Americans. Already, we represent the 5th largest nation on Earth. And in fact, in Canada's largest city, Toronto, the average resident today is what used to be called a foreigner, somebody born in a very different country.
So that was 3 years ago, and it was 220 million people. Any
Yes.
idea what it is today?
No, but they say it's going to be 450 million in a generation.
450 million people.
It's increasing that quickly. And I think now London in the UK, I believe the same thing is true. The average person is born in a foreign country.
I think you've used the phrase, they are full-time citizens of nowhere. Does that sum it up?
No, but I think what does sum it up is that more and more of us, including probably all of us around this table, have to create our sense of home. It's not something we inherited, and it's a kind of collage, it's a mosaic. So all of us are little Canadas. We're about exactly the same project as your country is, taking pieces of everywhere and making something interesting and new out of it.
I do think the last time you were here, I said, where are you, something like, where are you from? And you said, well, depends what airport I'm in on what day.
Exactly, yes, does sound like me. But happily, I'm no longer a minority saying that, because everybody seems to be saying that.
Lots indeed. Okay, let's get into this. The rise of populist nationalism, which you just talked about a moment ago. Hostility towards multicultural diversity. It's spreading in many countries. I'd like to know, Joseph, let me start with you. Why is this happening, apparently, in so many countries at the same time?
The European countries were not able to find a common policy towards immigration. They just were not able. Immigration is still the obligation of every single nation. And the same with the refugees. For example, in 2014, in October, there was this shipwreck off Lampedusa, and 300 refugees died. And there was a public outcry. We have to do something about it. and nothing happens. The only way to come to Europe then and now for refugees is to spend money for people trafficking, to spend just to. This has become a big business. It's a business of billions of dollars.
There's a market incentive for this to happen.
And the reason this business exists is because there are no legal routes to Europe for refugees. If you are a wealthy person somewhere in the world, you can come to Europe without any problem. But refugees who are either persecuted or who have to flee the war, or who just flee their hunger in their countries, they have no chance for a legal way to Europe, because there is no official immigration policy. There is no the European states so far are not able to see their territory as a common safe harbor for refugees. And so at the moment, every country has to deal with its own policy. And for example, after this huge impact of around 1 million refugees coming to Europe, after they just overran the borders, the European Union decided to take 160,000 people from Italy and Greece and to put them to other countries. Yeah? But this did not happen. Only 4,000 refugees just had the chance to go to other countries. The others are still waiting in Greece and in Italy for something to happen. And nothing happens. Usually, also in Germany, a refugee in Germany, for example, who arrived 1 year ago, is still waiting what is happening. The only thing he could do this 1 year is playing with his cell phone and waiting. He was not allowed to work, not allowed to do anything, just waiting.
Let me get the view from London, UK. Why do you think so many of these countries are going through this same phenomenon all at once?
I think there's something to be said about the refugee crisis, but I think this ill-ease or dis-ease about diversity is before the refugee crisis. And I think what it speaks to at the very heart of the matter is an identity crisis in Europe. The problem isn't with these minority groups, it's the problem of the fear of small numbers. An Indian theorist has talked about this, Appadurai, when speaks about this idea that how small numbers of individuals or collectivities and sometimes really derail a majority. And Europe has a particular identity crisis. In places like Germany, Austria, France, what does it mean to be Austrian or German or French or Belgian? These are identities which have historically been linked to language, to ethnicity, to a certain kind of cultural nationalism. But what happens in the postmodern, post-colonial world, where now people are becoming French who are from Algeria and from Tunis and from Marrakesh? There's a difficulty. There's a real problem.
It chips away at your understanding of who you are?
I think it's a real problem of how do these countries define themselves as a national project rather than an ethno-cultural linguistic project. In that way, the United Kingdom is unique. We're the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland, already 4 nations included in the United Kingdom. I come from a city, London, which is so hyper-diverse. I also come from a country where we call ourselves British. And Britishness, like Canadianness, and to some extent like Americanness, is a work in progress. It is a project. It's a national project, whether we like it or not. Now, there are many who voted for Brexit, and the likes of Nigel Farage and UKIP, and even the worse political actors like the English Defence League or the British National Party, who like to see Britishness in ethno-specific terms. But the truth is, Britishness is a mongrel identity. It's a national political project. And I think this is where Europe is falling at the hurdles. We in Europe generally have been unable to identify a way to involve people within people, ordinary people, within understanding what a national political project is. What do we as a country stand for? Which is interesting when we compare it to Canada, where in a way that national project has been there for several generations. I don't think we always do it very well. I think Canadians have a habit of thinking we do it very well, but we often don't do it very well. But at least we're doing it. And I do feel that in the United States, there's always a sense of this is there is, of course, an American dream and a narrative which can be very exclusive, but at the same time, there's something really compelling about that. And I think Canadians are shaped by that as well. And I think at the heart of this, as much as this is an economic question, as much as it's a global political question, it is also an ideological question.
Well, let me ask about immigration to Mexico, because you've had the good, in inverted commas, you've had the good fortune to have most of your immigration be from other Latin American countries where pretty much everybody's Catholic and pretty much everybody speaks Spanish. What would you envisage the reaction in Mexico to be if everybody didn't speak Spanish and everybody weren't Roman Catholic? Would it be different?
Well, we're a very hypocritical country regarding immigration that crosses through our borders. From El Salvador, from Guatemala, we mistreat immigrants crossing through Mexico as badly as the U.S. treats Mexicans who cross into the United States. And that is something that we are going to have to come to terms with historically. We've lived with the national myth of being inclusive, of being tolerant. Mexico was one of the few Latin American countries that was never a military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. We were open to Spanish refugees during the Civil War. We were open to refugees coming out of military dictatorships in Brazil and Chile and so on. And yet we are a very intolerant place. And I don't speak about it necessarily in ethnic terms, although we've been very intolerant vis-a-vis our Indians, our indigenous population, the Tzetzales, Tzotziles, the rebels in Chiapas, for example, in the 1980s. But I think we're seeing another intolerance that does not stem from ethnicity, but it is also an issue that delves into tolerance and into diversity, which has to do with the treatment of the LGBT community. In Mexico now, we're struggling with gay marriage. The president put forth an initiative. It's now in Congress, and it's stalled because the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico, as in elsewhere in Latin America, is starting a moral crusade against the homosexual gay community in Mexico. And in horrible terms, using the most disparaging language, joto, machorra. These are Mexican terms that refer to homosexuals and gays in a way that would no longer be politically acceptable in diverse countries, but in Mexico still is. 1 million Mexicans marched last weekend against gay marriage throughout the country. And I think that there is a way of trying to shut out diversity that transcends ethnicity. It also has to do with religion. I teach a class in comparative politics at the university, and we talk a lot about the end of history and how Fukuyama augured that this would be the case. Well, it's turning out to not be the case.
Not quite.
Not quite, because the argument isn't over liberal democracy anymore or over capitalism. It's about ethnicity, it's about religion, it's about sexual orientation. And if you look at the hot spots, the countries that have the highest degree of conflict right now, the debate isn't over economic systems. It's not socialism versus capitalism. It's about whether you wear a burkini or not. Yeah. It's about whether you can marry someone of the same sex and adopt a child or not. And so we're entering, I think, into a new era of conflict.
Before I go back to Pico here, I want to go off on a little tangent and anticipate a question that I suspect some of our viewers have right now, which is, how is it that somebody who is being talked about as a potential president for Mexico speaks English so bloody well?
Well, let's see. I have 3 children, and they have 3 passports. They are children of NAFTA, of the North American Free Trade Agreement. They have a Canadian, an American, and a Mexican passport. They were born in Mexico, but they have a Canadian father, and my father was American. So we are a cultural mix. They studied here in Toronto for a number of years, Upper Canada College, St. Clement's. They're now at universities in the US and in Canada, and when they're asked who they are and where they're from, they have a hard time explaining because they could pull out any of their passports. They could assume a temporary identity. They're in some ways rooted and in other ways rootless. And I think they're emblematic of the changing nature of identity in the 21st century.
They're North Americans.
They're North Americans, and yet they have names that were given to them that could be pronounced in exactly the same way in any language.
Go ahead, tell them.
Julia, Samuel, y Sebastián. Julia, Samuel, and Sebastian.
Fabulous. Pico, some countries, as we're discovering, are really pretty good at multiculturalism, and others are not. What makes the difference, do you think?
I always have more faith in individuals than governments. And I think individuals are much readier to see beyond divisions than governments. And I think one reason outsiders like myself are so admiring of Canada is that, as you were saying at the beginning of the program, your government, from the time of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was taking this larger vision and seeing this reality and realizing that if diversity was a fact of life, we should treat it as a gift. We should make the most of it. You can't argue with reality. You have to take what reality is and make the most of it. And as everybody has been saying, the more internationalism you have in the world, the more nationalism there will be in response. But I think Canada has a gift that the country where I'm officially resident, the US, doesn't, which is of putting this on the table and thinking seriously, how are we going to construct a new kind of society? Where, in England, which is the place where I grew up in, I think, as with the United States, is kind of backing into it half reluctantly, whereas Canada has seen it as an opportunity. And I think so much of this has to do with how you choose to look at the situation.
But we've always been, I mean, we have two founding cultures, right? English and French in Canada.
Yes.
We have that advantage of having
Big
been,
advantage.
in some respects, multicultural from day one.
Exactly.
Whereas in
Yes.
the United States, no.
Yes, I know. And of course, in the United States, only 30% of people have passports. If I'm traveling in the world and if I'm in a very interesting place and I hear a North American accent, I say, excuse me, are you from Toronto or Vancouver? I just assume it's not somebody from New York or Boston. It's interesting, just 3 weeks ago, I was in Bhutan, which again is facing this very dramatically because among the purest and most protected monocultures on the planet, and yet realizing that it can't be isolated. And even a little country like that is facing refugee problems. But they too have coined this notion of gross national happiness as a way of thinking, how can we think in broader terms than the
It's a great
accepted
expression,
ones.
isn't it?
It
Gross
is,
national
yes.
happiness.
Yes, it's taken off everywhere.
We had another Joseph on the program not too long ago, Joseph Yaffe. You must know him. Yeah. Editor of Die Zeit, who talked a year ago about how extraordinarily optimistic he was and proud of Germany he was, that the country had put out the welcome mat for 1 million people who were not of German background. And now we hear the story that you just told us not so long ago, and we look at the poll numbers from Angela Merkel, the chancellor there, which have gone right into the, I was going to say into the toilet, but you're not allowed to say that on a family program. Was he overly optimistic when he shared those feelings with us a year ago?
He was optimistic, sure, but I was proud as well. I think in 1 year ago, the majority of Germans was proud about what they did. Wir schaffen das. We can do it. Yeah? This was 1 year ago, and now the mood has changed.
Now it's wir schaffen das nicht.
We don't want it.
We don't want it.
Not we can do it. We don't want it anymore. Huh. That's the new mood. But there is a difference. You have to. There is a difference, for example, between the big cities and the countryside, and there is a difference between the east and the west. The interesting thing is that the Central European states, which belong to the former communist empire, they don't want to take refugees. There's very much rooted in a nationalism that goes back to the 19th century. They really, and the big cities, for example, in Berlin, in Köln, or also in Vienna in Austria. This is not a problem. This is the people behave differently also in the elections.
But tell us how it is in Germany, because you're from you're from what they used to call East Germany, right?
I work in East Germany, in Leipzig, yes. And also there is a difference. You have Leipzig, which is one of the bigger cities in the eastern part of Germany. The problem is not that big. Dresden is an exception. Dresden, because these Pegida, these demonstrations against foreigners, actually, and against refugees in a weekly base happening in Dresden, most of the participants come from the countryside, from the villages around Dresden. They are not the people from Dresden itself. So but nevertheless, we have to say that Angela Merkel, all in all, tries to stick to her notion and to stick to her idea, and that's very important. Because although in the party the mood has changed as well, and especially from Bavaria, the politicians from Bavaria they really are fighting her actually. They want her to change the policy, but she doesn't. And you said that her reputation or the how do you say
the poll numbers? The
poll numbers are falling down, but nevertheless they are still high. She's still the highest politician, has the highest rates of all politicians in Germany.
So she will run again?
I think so, yes. And I think it's important that she does. And it's important for the development in Germany.
Understood. Given your North American background, let me put this question this way. We in Canada love to think that we're a great model for the rest of the world when it comes to this issue that we're talking about tonight. Do you think that we have something to teach the world based on our experience of the last 45 years with this policy?
I think you do. In Mexico, I always speak of Canada as something to aspire to, not of the U.S. in terms of its capitalism, its social safety nets, its welfare state, its pluralism, its diversity. I confess, I'll say it publicly, I have a big crush on Justin Trudeau for several reasons. It's not because he's handsome, although he is. It's because when he was asked why he had so many women in his cabinet, he said, well, it's 2015. And because he welcomed Syrian refugees, and because Canada has been a force for good, I think, in the world in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of humanitarian intervention, in terms of a foreign policy that is quite sophisticated and quite independent vis-a-vis the U.S. in a way that many countries in the world have not been. And I think those are important lessons to teach.
Here's the key question going forward, though, and I guess I'll put this to you first, and we're going to look at some tape first. Because as much as you love Justin Trudeau, when he did meet the mayor of London, your hometown right now, who happens to be a Muslim, the first ever in London's history, they had a meeting, and some people actually weren't thrilled with what the Prime Minister of Canada had to say. But let's hear it firsthand, and then we'll have a discussion about it. Go ahead, please, Sheldon.
In my district in Saint Michel, there are Italian grandmothers who still pretty much only speak Italian, don't speak much French or English, but their kids and their grandkids are seamlessly and completely integrated into Montreal, and the only difference is that they tend to be trilingual and not just bilingual. And that's, this is understanding that when we think about integration and success, we can't be overly impatient. We need to be respectful and keep a solid pressure and forward movement.
The shared values that Canada is famous for is so important, and it's really important that the left recognizes we've got to address this issue. The time of laissez-faire integration is going to happen by itself. Just chillax. Those days are gone.
That felt like a point of departure between Mayor Khan and Prime Minister Trudeau, where the PM says, we got to take our time on this and not force this, and Mayor Khan saying, the days of chillaxing are over, we got to go for this right now. What do you think?
I have to agree with Sadiq Khan on this, and I have a lot of reservations about Prime Minister Trudeau, and I have a lot of reservations about the mythology of multiculturalism in this country. That having been said, I think there is something about, and I'll come back to it, about a political project. And I think what we're seeing in cities like London is the need, a growing need and a growing acceptance by people who would see themselves as progressive or on the political left, and who see inclusive societies and progressive political societies as a value to be aspired to. We also see the importance of a political project which has a roadmap for inclusion. But that is predicated on an engaged citizenship, a citizenry that is active and involved. One of the interesting things going on, I don't know if you've been following, maybe some of your viewers have, is the Labour Party's political race in the United Kingdom. We have a very left-wing, solidly socialist leader of the Labour Party defending his position, running for the party again. Who are his supporters? Who are the people, this momentum movement that they talk about?
It's Jeremy Corbyn.
It's Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn supporters are urban, they're diverse, they're children of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Somalis and Nigerians. They're children of people from the white working class.
The Bernie Sanders types.
Yeah, who really understand what it means to mobilize and who understand the importance of a political project which puts certain political values at the helm. I agree that sometimes the prosaic interaction between people is important. But ultimately, I think the future I dream of for my son, who's 5.5 years old, is that he'll grow up to be a global soul, to use Pico's term from that's so relevant today. But at the same time, someone who will be committed to a political project, who sees that progressive, inclusive politics and the amelioration of economic and social injustice and the full inclusion of people from a whole range of minorities and ethnicities and identities find a space in the public square. That's just not going to happen. And I think one of the problems with Canadian multiculturalism is that we've felt like we'll let the policy take care of it. Multiculturalism takes care of itself. We have an official department, we have some nice programs, but what about political power? Can multiculturalism at times be disempowering? Does multiculturalism in Canada paper over the cracks? The cracks are there. We talk about two founding nations. We talk about two founding colonizing nations over a continent which had Indigenous people who are still nations, but whose rights under this government, under Trudeau's government, are also being trampled on as they've been trampled on by other governments. Well, now if we bring Indigenous people, if we bring colonization into it, if we bring these historical movements, then I think now the ground becomes a lot more murky. And this is where, Pico, I embrace what you're saying. It's about individuals. It's about us embracing our role as individuals and as political actors, as global souls. As those who are rooted, and I wouldn't say rootless, because the tribe that you talked about in that amazing TED Talk isn't rootless. It's rooted in a set of global values. And I think what's happening in places like Toronto, London, New York, Cape Town, Singapore, is that in many ways we are feeling less Canadian, less British, less South African, but we're feeling a lot more rooted to the cities that we belong to, because these are laboratories of diversity.
With just a couple of minutes left, let me get you to weigh in on this issue of who's right between the Mayor of London and the Prime Minister of Canada. We should chillax and let this happen over time, or we got to go for it right now and hit it on the head?
I think the Brexit vote has proven really that Canada is wiser about these things than Britain. So absolutely, I'm with your Prime Minister, and I think the way it's unfolded here since 1971, when you began talking about multiculturalism, for all the huge deficiencies and flaws that everybody in Canada is aware of, is beyond what I see when I go to Australia or England or the United States. And whenever I come to Toronto, I say, I feel your frustrations with things in this society, but show me where it's working better. And I haven't come up with, I don't think Dubai is a model of our future, nor North Korea. So,
Denise?
And just to finish, all the models you gave of diverse cities are in the first world. Look at what's happening. I mean, you're actually discussing sort of first world, first order problems in terms of multiculturalism. I mean, look at what's happening in countries where I come from. where we're not just, ethnicity and multiculturalism, they are, third-tier problems compared to the fact that we have 99% of unsolved crimes. 6 out of 10 women face domestic violence. 53 million Mexicans live below the poverty line. And this is emblematic of emerging markets and democracies throughout the world. So while I appreciate your critique of Prime Minister Trudeau, compare Canada to what's happening in the rest of the world, and frankly, you guys have it pretty good.
But Denise, that's not a political argument. I can't accept that as a political argument. I do accept it from that we're speaking from a position of privilege, certainly, and the fact that global economic marginalization, the neoliberal, the collapse of the neoliberal agenda when it comes to the poorest in the world is a reality, and it fuels so much hatred and anger and violence. At the same time, I think as Canadians, as people who are British or those who reside in the European Union, there's a highly legitimate critique. I'm not happy as a Canadian or as a British citizen to rest on the laurels of what I think my society has achieved, when in our own societies, economic marginalization, poverty, homelessness continue, whether it's in London or it's in Toronto or it's in Vancouver or it's Birmingham or Manchester.
Let me save 30 seconds for you, Denise. Go ahead.
I wasn't claiming that. What I was saying is I think there's a lot of good going on in this country in terms of how you've handled multiculturalism, and there are important lessons to be learned. Yes, set the bar higher, and I agree with you. I'm a fighter in Mexico for raising the bar, but at the same time, recognize what has been accomplished here. This is an example for the world in many areas, and keep on pushing. But at the same time, I think look at what happened here with Syrian refugees. Canada is not Germany. A year later, the situation here isn't, we don't want it. It's, the experiment has worked.
As long as you say
that many refugees from Syria, for example, Canada, they were
25,000.
This was also the United States that was very disappointed.
10,000 there.
No.
Yeah. As long as we're, give me 10 more seconds to ask one more question, because you said keep pushing. So I'm going to push on this last question here, okay? Yeah. When's the next presidential election in Mexico?
2018.
You going to run for president?
Well, it's very hard to run as an independent. We have very deeply rooted political parties that are corrupt, that are well-financed.
The pre and the pan?
Exactly. And so running as an independent in Mexico, it's easier to achieve peace in the Middle East. The barriers to entry are extremely high.
You know what? That's not a no. I didn't hear a no.
I will continue to think about it. Although I've become a lightning rod as a woman, as bicultural, and as a preeminent fighter for causes that are unpopular in Mexico. So I don't know if that's going to place me at the center of the race or turn me into perhaps a refugee in Canada.
Well, you know what? I've been to the top of the CN Tower, and there are lots of lightning rods up there, and they perform a very useful function, I can tell you. Can I thank all of you for coming into TVO tonight? Enjoy your time here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Great to see you two again, and you two for the first time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.